So Barack Obama was recently talking at a fundraising event to a room of rich Democratic donors, and let's take a look at what he had to say.
A stern warning coming from former President Barack Obama. In a room full of top Democratic donors, he cautioned 2020 candidates about the long-term risk of swinging too far to the left on key issues.
Even as we push the envelope and we are bold in our vision, we also have to be rooted in reality and the fact that voters, including Democratic voters and certainly persuadable independents or even moderate Republicans, are not driven by the same views that are reflected on certain left-leaning Twitter feeds or the activist wing of our party. This is still a country that is less revolutionary than it is interested in improvement. They like seeing things improve, but the average American doesn't think that we have to completely tear down the system and remake it. And I think it's important for us not to lose sight of that.
All right, joining me right now to talk about all this, CNN political commentator David Swerdlick and White House correspondent for Reuters, Jeff Mason. Good to see you. All right, so Jeff, well, this is an interesting, I guess, bit of advice, to the 2020 candidates. Is he right that you just can't, lose sight of how people are feeling, thinking, living right now before you propose too much?
Well, I think the message behind that message, Fred, is that he wants whoever becomes the Democratic nominee to be able to win. And he's suggesting in pretty direct terms that he's concerned that some of the more progressive candidates who are running right now are putting proposals out there that will not necessarily stand up in a general election. He doesn't name any names, but you have to assume, particularly when he's mentioning health care, that he has Elizabeth Warren in mind, Bernie Sanders in mind. It's interesting, and it's coming from somebody who has so far really not weighed in very much on the primaries and has obviously said that he's going to work very hard for whoever becomes the nominee. But he, like many Democrats, wants to make sure that whoever that nominee is able to beat Donald Trump.
So, David, how should progressive candidates, like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, respond to that message from Barack Obama?
Yeah, good morning, Fred. Look, President Obama is still the most popular figure in the Democratic Party, so it does none of the candidates any good to keep him at arm's length or to crack back at him. But at the same time, I do think some of these candidates have to at least sort of absorb this advice he's giving them because, number one, as Jeff says, he's trying to tell them how to maybe win a race against Trump in the general election, but also that Obama was always like this. He was always a no-drama Obama, go slow guy, and it's that it took people a long time to get their arms around it, but this is his nature. He has Warren's sort of galaxy brain. He has, Pete Buttigieg's style, but I think his heart and soul is with that Joe Biden kind of let's take things easy and one at a time approach.
Okay, so if there was ever a garbage take by a former president, this is very high up there. Where to begin? Where to begin, frankly? He's saying that most Americans are not ready for a revolution and they want to maintain the status quo. Really? Is that why Bernie Sanders won 23 primaries last election, before you snatched it from him and shanked him out of the nomination? Is that why he won almost half of the primaries, basically, which were still awarded to Hillary Clinton? And he's saying that, most Americans aren't swayed by left-wing Twitter policies. What, you mean like Medicare for all, which most people support, Republicans and Democrats? By the way, even if you look at Republican-only polls, the majority still supports Medicare for all. So, same thing with the $15 minimum wage. Most Americans support that. A majority of them also support legalizing marijuana. I mean, I can't really name a single progressive policy that isn't popular with a majority of Americans, according to the polls. So this is garbage nonsense from Mr. Barack Obama. And he did something similar 2 weeks ago, if you recall. He was at the Obama Foundation and he was sitting there in his armchair and lecturing people about call-out culture and about being woke, which is a blatant attempt to simplify what's going on. You know, he's trying to cover his ass because he's scared that people are going to call out his record. So what he's doing here basically is he's calling out Bernie Sanders. He's calling out Elizabeth Warren and the progressive wing of the party, which, like we've seen before, Nancy Pelosi has done this. A lot of establishment Democrats are in the habit of saying, oh, don't go too far left, you'll scare voters. Hillary Clinton also doing that. This indicates that these establishment figures are scared. They are very scared because what they are seeing is the opposite of what they're telling you. Okay? When they tell you that billionaires are scared of Elizabeth Warren, they're not really scared of Elizabeth Warren. They're scared of the one they're not talking about, Bernie Sanders. And when they tell you that, oh, voters are scared of going too far left, no, they're not. The polling indicates the complete opposite. The primary results from the last election indicate the clear opposite. The fact that Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the country indicates the opposite. The fact that he has more donors, more cash, more grassroots support than any other candidate indicates the opposite. So whatever these establishment figures tell you, Democrat and Republican, always assume the opposite. Whatever we're talking about, it, foreign policy, domestic policy, elections, always assume the opposite. And it's very funny that he's lecturing about activism. You know, Barack Obama had an enormous grassroots network by the time he got elected. He had something like 3 million individual donors, 2 million volunteers. It was ridiculous. Like a true grassroots movement. He built that with his candidacy and then abandoned it. You know, he could have used that as a tool to get everything accomplished. This is what Bernie Sanders talks about when you get elected. You hold rallies. You bring the people together. You go to the state where senators and congressmen and governors are blocking legislation. You give them the voice of the people. You put it in their face. He could have done that. No, what did he do? He compromised on healthcare. He gave Americans a right-wing healthcare plan. He gave big fat checks and nice comfy positions to Big Pharma. Their stock tripled under his administration. Let that sink in for a second. Pharmaceutical stocks tripled under his presidency. Okay, the FDA became a revolving door. When we talk about corruption, how people leave the government to go work in the healthcare industry, or any industry rather, and vice versa. He put tons of people from Goldman Sachs and Wall Street in his administration and abandoned his movement. He abandoned all the grassroots support that he had built up during the candidacy, during the election. He just used people effectively to get elected and then dropped it. This is who we're talking about. And the fact that he's lecturing about activism and dismissing the grassroots support that we're seeing, have been seeing for the last few years under the wing of Bernie Sanders is very funny. It's very funny indeed. Even though he's not naming names, it is an attack on the progressive wing and Bernie Sanders particularly, which is a shame. You know, Barack Obama a few years ago was actually quite favorable of Bernie Sanders and seemed like they might have been on the same wavelength, on the same vibe. Let me just show you a clip of that real quick.
I think people are ready for a call to action. They want to move forward. They want to have honest leadership who cares about them, who thinks about them first, who isn't going down to Washington so that they can get a bunch of fancy steak dinners and have doors open for them and drive around in limousines and buy fancy suits, which you know you don't have to worry about with Bernie. Where do you get that suit, man? Right off the rack. That's not what they want. They want somebody who's going to fight for them. Somebody who's going to say, you know what, let's have a prescription drug plan that's written on behalf of the people of America instead on behalf of the prescription drug companies. Why don't we try something like that? Let's have a budget that reflects our values
and our priorities, that doesn't cut veteran spending even as we claim to be patriotic, that doesn't end up cutting student loans at the same time as you say you want to promote higher education and increase competitiveness for the United States. How about an administration and a Congress that insists on a foreign policy that is both tough and smart? Since right now we've got a party that has the monopoly on the tough-dumb foreign policy strategy. That's what people are looking for. And they will find it in Bernie, and they'll find it in Peter. You will find it in these two gentlemen back here. And you don't have to take my word for it, because you know these guys. You've seen what they do.
So again, I think this whole excerpt from his speech at this fundraiser, and also what he was doing 2 weeks ago at the Obama Foundation, I think he's just trying to reassure the party elites and the donor class, and also he's covering his own behind because he's scared that people are waking up. You know, they're starting to become disillusioned with the entire political process and realize, like, wow, actually, what did Barack Obama do? You know, he just turned 2 wars into 7 wars and bombed Syria and Libya and Yemen and Somalia and ramped up the drone strikes with a 90% civilian death rate. And he just helped Big Pharma and Wall Street and bailed them out and screwed over the middle class. And he brought Trump into office. So what did he really accomplish? I mean, the Iran deal was pretty good, but besides that. So people are starting to take a critical look at his past, at his administration, and he's scared. And yes, it is activism when you see independent media like this, like other shows, bringing this to people's attention. This is activism. Remember, they say the media is the 4th branch of government. And it is activism when people like Cenk Uygur and Kyle Kalinske and, these YouTubers are suddenly pushing people into government and creating things like Justice Democrats and then running themselves. That's activism. Okay? So he's scared. Of course he's scared. He's part of the establishment. People tend to think that, oh, because he's chill and he's kind of cool and charismatic, that he's other or he's apart. No, he is the establishment. Just, it is what it is. So he's scared that people are starting to take a critical look back at his administration, and it's very amusing to watch. And my only response to everything that Obama is saying about the progressive wing is, okay, Boomer,